Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Monday Sister Parish webinar. Today, we reflect on the gospel values and the call to the people of God at the end of each liturgy. We're called to go forth glorifying the Lord by our lives. As members of the baptized community, we're called to love and serve the Lord. We will also reflect on the preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, and how do we encounter the poor. Our speakers today are Deacon Duncan Harris and Kathy Camp. They serve as pastoral associates for St. Joseph's Church, as well as co-directors and founders of Penfield Hope. Duncan also serves as deacon at Mass for both Holy Spirit and St. Joseph's. Both have empowered many volunteers in our social outreach ministries and have been involved daily in our sister parish's critical pastoral response to the pandemic crisis. We want to thank them for their ministry in our sister parishes. And we also welcome today Jean Mooney, our Director of Faith Formation, who, along with me, Nancy Veronese, Director of Worship, we will be taking your questions and sharing them with Kathy and Duncan. And so I introduce to you Duncan and Kathy.
Thank you so much for being here and sharing with us. One of certainly both Kathy's and my passions, service to the poor and those in community. And we want to talk today out of the context of our liturgy. We gather together for liturgy and we come as a people of God. But one of the things that has always impressed me about this, and you see from this wonderful graphic of our Pope Francis, the joy. And the Mass is basically there to feed us, to help send us forth. The Mass actually literally means sending us forward, going out into the world. The Mass feeds us as community, but the Mass doesn't come to an end. It actually continues and issues us forward. And so the liturgy is there to serve, to help us understand that we're called to serve one another. And when we gather around the table of the altar and the priest offers the bread and wine, they're meant for food, for us to feed us and to share. So now we'll go forward to the next slide. We'll talk about what Christian service is all about. And again, we're called, all of us, to service. God has given us all different kinds of gifts. And what's unique is that's how God provides for his world, by providing us all with gifts that we are charged to go forward and use. And we have this special mission, if you will, to those who are poor, vulnerable. And as we think about the gospel in Jesus' life, Jesus emulated what he expects of us. He gave us an example. He gave us an example that, again, we're to share the gifts that God has given us. So the Mass feeds us and sends us forth, but it's not an end, it's a beginning. And I like to reflect on, and I'm sure you've all heard of this, the question that says, what would Jesus do? And that's a very powerful and great question, and it's very helpful. But when we think about some of the aspects of social outreach, of the wonders that we have from our Catholic social teaching, a very important thing to consider is, what did Jesus do? Now we can wonder about the things that he would do if he were here today, but what did he do at his own time, in his own place, in his culture, in his life? And what we know is Jesus spent so much time with the poor, the vulnerable, the sick. He modeled his life for us so that we understood that he has this preferential option for the poor. And today, as we're in the midst of this global pandemic, it's even more important that we think about those who are poor, suffering. We often are finding now that people who haven't had those situations arise in their life are now facing a new situation. And God is always calling us forward to reach out and use the gifts that we're given to help the poor, the vulnerable. You see, just in these photos that we have on the slide, just some examples. One that's on the left is our team actually going out from St. Joseph's to help the poor in Rochester. We went out on a cold winter night and reached out to those. We see some clients from Penfield Hope in a food cupboard where we're feeding the poor. These are examples of just a few that both Kathy and I will talk about in more detail about, again, how we're called together to gather as a community, how we worship together, and then we're given food to go forth, to live out our journey and seek and use the gifts that we're given to help those less fortunate than us. And sometimes it may be reaching out, sometimes listening can be as important as feeding, but we need to use all the gifts that God has given us.
So a question that we'd like to ask you as we continue, and you are most welcome to type your reflections or answers in the chat section. So the question would be, how do you define Christian service?
You know, an interesting thing about Christian service in the context of the Catholic Church is that just as it does in so many areas of theology, the Church gives us very, very clear teaching. And also, as in so many other areas of Catholic teaching, it is based both in Scripture, as Duncan was just saying, in what Jesus actually did. And it's also based in the tradition of our Church and the doctrine of our Church. So while what we do as Catholics goes back over 2,000 years to what Jesus actually did, for the past 100 years, social doctrine has really been evolving, and our popes over this past century have really put a tremendous amount of focus on this area to help guide us as Catholics in terms of what we are meant to do. And this has never been more important than it is today. The coronavirus brings with it not only a health crisis, but also an evolving pandemic of poverty. We see that there is increased food insecurity throughout the world, including in our own country. We see that, here in New York State, there has been a moratorium on evictions, but eviction courts have reopened, and that has the potential to really wreak havoc on people's lives in the weeks and months ahead. So we'll talk about that more in the context of our Penfield Hope Ministry, but we certainly are anticipating that we're going to be seeing, people really in crisis in the weeks and the months ahead. So it's important for us to keep ourselves sort of grounded in, we're not all, helping with this sort of thing just to be nice. This is what we're actually called to do. This is what our faith informs us to do. So we want to talk a bit about the 7 principles of Catholic social teaching. And these principles are actually grounded in the 7th commandment. Why would they be grounded in the 7th commandment, which says not to steal? Thou shalt not steal. Well, we don't steal from the poor, do we? Well, actually, our Catholic teaching would tell us that if we are not sharing the things that we have received as a gift from God, the things God put here on this earth for all of us to benefit from, if we're not sharing the disproportionate amount that we have been so fortunate to receive, we are in fact stealing from those who do not have. So it's a very jarring sort of concept to think about, but going as far back, as to the early centuries, St. John Chrysostom talked about it, and Pope Francis, if you read any of his recent exhortations or encyclicals, it's a constant theme of his too. So what are these 7 principles of Catholic social teaching? We're going to just go quickly through 6 of them and then focus on the 7th. So the The 7 principles are the life and dignity of the human person, the call to family, community, and participation, rights and responsibilities, the dignity of work and the rights of workers, solidarity, our care for the environment, and the preferential option for the poor and vulnerable. Now we're going to advance that slide. There we go. So the first is the life and dignity of the human person. So certainly as Catholics, we know that this particular teaching, grounded in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, very much informs our beliefs about abortion and the right to life, about euthanasia and assisted suicide, about the death penalty, about the rights of immigrants and strangers coming into our country. And why is that? It's because as Catholics we believe that every person is made in the image of God. We are all children of God. The second would be about family, community, and participation. And the idea here is that we are all, Jean Moody and I like when we talk with families to say that, you know, all families are holy, right? Wherever you are right now, whatever your circumstance, no matter how crazy it might feel to you, each family is holy in the eyes of God. And that family is that central institution that as Catholics we very much are called to protect and defend. But also that we have this responsibility to participate. And we tend to get very focused on this in presidential election years, right? But that we do in fact have a duty and a responsibility not to vote one particular way, but to vote our consciences and to really participate in the issues going on locally. So rights and responsibilities would be the third. Again, that we all have a right to live in this world. We have a right to have the things that are basic human rights: food, shelter, water, clothing. But that we also, along with those rights, comes a duty and a responsibility to one another in our immediate worlds, our family, but also within our communities and our society. Work is a very important concept as part of Catholic social teaching. So there is the dignity of work, that we are all meant to be able to do productive work for a decent wage. We are allowed to form unions. We have a right to participate in the economy. This is another thing that Pope Francis sometimes gets caught in a bit of controversy about, but he's very bold in stating that the economy, the global economy, exists to serve the people and not the other way around. In other words, people should not be working for unjust wages in unsafe conditions to make other people rich. But that's a tough one sometimes for us to swallow. So solidarity, big word that sometimes gets tossed around a lot. In the Joy of the Gospel, Pope Francis says, this word is a little worn and at times poorly understood, but it refers to something more than a few sporadic acts of generosity. It presumes the creation of a new mindset, which thinks in terms of community and the priority of life, all over the appropriation of goods by a few. He says, let us learn solidarity. Without solidarity, our faith is dead. So in other words, we must really join ourselves with those who have less than we do, and to really have a whole new mindset about how we work alongside each other. A few weeks ago, Father Jeff did a wonderful webinar for us on the care of God's creation. I think that's still up on our website if you wanted to refer back to that, but that is, again, one of the principles of Catholic social teaching. And so we want now to focus on the preferential option for the poor. And we wanted to share with you one of our favorite videos on this subject, and then we'll get to some of your comments. So if you'll bear with me for one moment, I'm going to stop sharing this screen. and then we are going to share the video. I'm saying this with so much confidence.
Before we understand Jesus' preferential option for the poor, we have to understand God's preferential option for the poor. God incarnates himself as Jesus among a poor family in a poor village, and Jesus himself preaches among the poor and preaches about the poor.
This is how God is. He is a God who had a special love for those who had no one to turn to. Not because they're righteous, not because they're the most holy and most saintly, but because they are in need. And God comes to their rescue.
In Matthew 25, Christ tells us, "Whatsoever you do for the least of my brothers and sisters, you do unto me." And it's such a beautiful reminder for us that the people we serve who are in poverty, who are in need, are in fact the face of Christ. And because of that, have so much to teach us.
So when we go to encounter the poor, let us encounter them as a fellow poor person. Not from a perspective of superiority where they're in the dark, I'm in the light, all of these things. No, I grow in my own humanity when I encounter the person of the poor.
Who are the poor in our society? The poor are those people who are really, really marginalized amongst us. The most vulnerable. Those who are forgotten in society.
Here in America, I don't think anyone can say, well, I do not know what's happening in those other parts of the world. But it's not enough to know. We should allow what we see, what we hear and know really touch us. And for us to have that mindset, I may be an American. The person who just lost his whole family is from Syria. But at this point of suffering, we are one.
The preferential option for the poor calls us to address both immediate needs and systemic problems, to look both at the person in front of us and to give them what they need in that moment, but also to say, why is this person in this place? What has happened in our society? What are the larger issues at work, and how can we address those larger issues?
When we see the situations to which the poor are subjected, dehumanizing, humiliating, you could say that those situations manifest the lack of love. Lack of love from other people, lack of love from society, for they did not choose to be poor. They are made poor by others and by systems and structures in society.
In our political lives, in our economic lives, in our social lives, whatever we do, we should always put the poor first.
People try to make caring for the poor out to be something very difficult or complicated or hard to understand. It's not. It basically means a few things. First of all, being charitable to the poor, giving to organizations that care for the poor, giving directly to the poor. It means loving the poor as our brothers and sisters. It means coming to know them, touching them, holding them, shaking their hands, and really physically coming in contact with them. Because otherwise, how would we show our love?
What a shame if a community claims to be the bearer of the good news, for that community not to live it, not to embody it. And so we ask the question, if the church will not do it, then who else will?
And so we have actually a comment, and I'd like to offer a question. Who do you think of when you hear, quote, the poor? When you hear that statement, who do you think of? And also we had a comment of the Penfield Ecumenical Food Shelf is an example of serving many in need, running very efficiently, and we have helpers who are with us today in in our webinar.
Excellent.
And so we ask, can you think of others who are poor or vulnerable that, might not seem, obvious to you at first? But I do really love the example of the Penfield Ecumenical Food Shelf and the great work that they do. Penfield Hope partners with them. And this is just a wonderful way that we reach out to the local community and help those in need. And many of them are neighbors that we might pass in the street. So sometimes when we talk about the poor and the vulnerable, we see pictures, including on this slide, of people that we understand. And what I like is if you look at the bottom right picture, there are many poor and vulnerable that are among us that we may not notice on the street. We may not notice their needs, but they're there. So we'll leave it open for just a moment. If anyone can think of, people who may be poor or vulnerable that may go unnoticed by us or by society. And Nancy, just let me know if you have any questions that come in or comments. So we'll move forward. But again, what we're saying is the poor, the vulnerable, the needy, they have many needs and often go unnoticed. But we go back to the scriptures because the scriptures have the basis, and the basis in obviously from the Gospels and Jesus' life. But we have this from Matthew 25, for I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. A stranger and you welcomed me. Naked and you clothed me. Ill and you cared for me. In prison and you visited me. And he concludes with, Amen, I say to you, whatever you did for one of the least brothers or sisters of mine, you did for me. And one of the things that I think, as we reflect on this, oftentimes I think in both ways, often we do things and we don't realize that we are helping the poor by our presence, by the organizations we support, by the things we do, and then also by the conscious things that we do, giving to the Penfield Ecumenical Food Shelf, to Penfield Hope, or to other organizations throughout our world, throughout our country. One thing that we reflect on as well, and I know I do, especially during the penitential rite, when we think of this, is some of our greatest sins are often not the sins that we do consciously, but sometimes they're ones of omission, what we call the greatest sins of omission. And we hear this in the penitential rite when we say, I sinned through my faults and my thoughts and my words and what I've done and what I've failed to do. And I think that must be charged on all of our hearts about not only the things that we're doing that are wonderful, but what are the things that God is calling us to do that we may be failing to listen to God. And I think that's an important piece. But scripture tells us in so many places, and by Jesus, just his presence for the poor, the outcast, and those who are separate from society, the widows. We hear about the widow mite who put in a small coin. Jesus said that was the greatest gift, him reaching out to the paralytic. So many things that Jesus has done with his life shows us how he is asking us to emulate, to think of our neighbor, think of those who are outcasts, and again, reflect on what the gospel is calling us to do, to think about who is the poor among us. And we're all sometimes feeding the poor or trying to reach out can seem overwhelming, but it can start with small actions that we all can do, bringing food to the food shelf, helping reaching out to a neighbor who may be in need. There's small things that we can all do.
We have three beautiful thoughts about who do we think of or what do we think of when we hear the term the poor. One person said that they think of those who are struggling to make ends meet. And another person says, especially now during the pandemic, they think of the young families who have lost work. And another person related to that is that they think of children who don't have enough food and how fortunate we are to have the Penfield Food Cupboard and Penfield Hope.
You know, I think those are such wonderful reflections about where we find the poor. And certainly in this time of the pandemic, it's really been highlighted. And as we're seeing also in developing nations, nations that were already having troubles, or even families within our own community that were having troubles prior to the pandemic, this has certainly made the situation much more difficult. Many small businesses are closing. A lot of the employment opportunities are closed down, especially for those who are poor or vulnerable, those that may be disabled. The other piece that we think about too, when we think about the vulnerable, it's not only those who are physically or have financial issues. There can be the vulnerable as far as dealing with emotional and mental illness, those that this time in the pandemic make it much more difficult. And there's ways that we can reach out to those communities as well. But I really applaud everyone for thinking of those things and being aware of where there are the poor among us, where there are people that we can help with.
Thank you, everyone, for your comments. So we wanted to move on now and talk about, with those images in our minds of who the poor are, what does it mean when we talk about encountering the poor? So, St. Vincent de Paul, who, so well known for his incredible service and charity, said we must love our neighbor as being made in the image of God and as an object of his love. So even though we might have an image in our minds of what, a poor person looks like as different from us, that we are all the same, again, in the eyes of God. And the Catechism also says that acts of charity for the poor are a good way to start living Catholic social teaching. The personal contact with those who need our help fulfills Christ's command to love the poor most effectively. So again, it takes us back to, what did Jesus actually do? He touched people others wouldn't touch. He went out of his way to make that one-on-one contact with the people who were most in need. And you might remember that Pope Francis, shortly after he became Pope, announced the Year of Mercy, which spanned 2015 and 2016. And it was during that time that we, as at St. Joseph's as a parish, and our parish council in particular, really started focusing on what did the Pope mean when he was talking about, encountering the poor. I hope she's listening today, but our former parish council chair, Marianne Lovelock, really became very much intrigued by what Pope Francis was teaching, particularly in a wonderful book, The Church of Mercy. It's a great collection of his homilies and other talks that he has given. And in one of them, he said this, he said, "Be ready for encounter. For me, this word is very important. Encounter with others. Why? Because faith is an encounter with Jesus, and we must do what Jesus does, encounter others." So it's not that charity isn't good. Please keep bringing your food donations for Philip the Van. That is absolutely important and wonderful. The question is, are we ready as individuals to take that next step and actually encounter people in need? So it's kind of a two-step process, if you will. And one of the things that during that Year of Mercy that Marianne really challenged our parish council to do was to ask each member during that year to choose one of our various parish ministries or something that they were aware of in their own lives where they could go out and encounter people. And it was really through that effort and people having these personal experiences. And we had a powerful council retreat where people came back and shared their experiences of going out on their homeless outreach or going to Dimitri House or Bethany House. And it really got our wheels turning, if you will, about what we needed to do next as a parish. And we'll talk about that more in a moment. Nancy, any other comments we should look at before we move on?
Yes, just to bring back, I just shared first of all, I shared our upcoming question. What has been your experience of encountering the poor? And we do have, from bringing back a question about who do I think of as poor? The first to come to mind are the disadvantaged people of color in our city, in our towns, in our own community. The children growing up in challenging circumstances and in danger of sliding into crime or into drugs. And so we have so many prayers and so many people to think of, and as little as we do, the little things add up. And so all of our prayers and all of our encounters with the poor through the food shelf and through Penfield Hope, I think all of us together really could make a difference.
Yeah, and so, as much as we want to make sure we emphasize that we do have, people living in poverty right here in Penfield, we'd be remiss if we didn't also point out that being here in Penfield, we are about, less than a 10-minute car ride from real abject poverty in the city of Rochester. No secret that the, educational system in Rochester is broken, and that something like 34%, I want to say, of children are living below the poverty line in the city of Rochester. So it is, the need is just staggering, just minutes away. And that is, very much largely an African-American community. So the other question we could ask ourselves as a parish community is, how come when we sit in the pews and look around, we look pretty homogenous most of the time? It's really something for us to reflect on, that all we have to do is get in our car and drive just minutes, and we are in a community that looks very, very different from us. Something I think all of us, really need to reflect on over time and begin to, break those walls down so that we do become more of an integrated society. So going back to that year of mercy, what it really led to for us as a parish community was looking at another model of ministry, one that would focus on encountering. We had done a little bit of research, and we knew at the time the diocese was really holding up Webster Hope, the Webster Hope House, as a model of social ministry, in that it was providing for basic needs, of course, in terms of food, but also what would be referred to today as wraparound services. So food is, kind of usually the very basic need that a family or an individual in crisis, needs us to address. But an important factor is also looking at what is causing this need. So we try through Penfield Hope, we talk about, responding to critical unmet needs, particularly right here in our Penfield zip codes, through meaningful encounters, dialogue, and practical service, kind of in that order when we can. So the idea being that when we're not in a pandemic, that we sit down with each person who comes in, usually two of us, and that we really try to understand, what brought them here today, what would be of the most help to them, and then also to ask a few questions, to really understand, why, how did they get to this place? How could we possibly help them achieve a little more stability so that in addition to the food, maybe there are some financial things we could be taking a look at. Maybe there's some budgeting we could help with. We try to just get beyond that initial need and try to understand the bigger picture.
There's also a number of ways. One of the programs that we have to reach out to the poor is utilizing, together with other parishes, St. Mary's and Blessed Sacrament together, to reach out and encounter the poor. As Kathy mentioned, just miles away, the situation is very much different than what we see for housing and for some economic advantages than what the city of Rochester has. So one of the encounters that we have in sort of building on this idea of encountering so that we could better understand, we go out and, although this has been paused during the pandemic due to health concerns, but we encourage parishioners and others to go out and encounter the homeless in the city of Rochester. And it does a couple of things. One, it helps raise awareness to those who may not be aware of the plight of the homeless in our city core and to see the situations, because often the poor often get pushed out of sight, and that's often done on purpose by governments, because we don't want to see that, and we want to push that to the side. So this outreach is to help people understand and see and encounter these individuals that often, through some life situations that could be any one of us in those situations, but they have fallen into that. The other piece is we bring food and hygiene packs to help these individuals, and we also bring social workers with us and provide temporary housing so that they can link up with some housing professionals and find permanent housing in permanent services such as mental health, other health services. So it's a multifunction reach out that we have. The other piece is through this organization, we're connected with a number of churches that we're trying to address the more systemic problems that come from, that cause these issues, so that we're not looking just solely to give you food for tonight, but looking at how can we join with other faith communities and other organizations in the city to address the systemic problems, the problems of discrimination, of racism, where people are discriminated against and they have a hard time moving from where they are to where they need to be.
Bethany House is another ministry that has been just very close to St. Joseph's for many, many years. I was blessed about 10 years ago while I was studying at St. Bernard's to do an internship for a couple of semesters. Bethany House is a Catholic worker house with its focus on homeless women and their children. Many of those women are recently coming out of incarceration and transitioning back into the community. There's 10 women at most at the house at any time, some with their children. And we have had parishioners volunteering in so many different roles there as cooks, as organizers of their food pantry, so many different things. The year that I was involved, we actually developed a mentoring program with the women who were coming out of incarceration. So a one-on-one opportunity to really walk with somebody through that process. I won't kid you, it was very, very challenging. But many of us still have relationships with the people that we got to know through that process. Each year, our RCIA candidates, which is the people in those two photos, our RCIA candidates do a community dinner And it's a wonderful opportunity to kind of bring this teaching into a focus, of here's how we can really serve people. We first participate in a prayer service, and then move on to serving a dinner that the candidates and others in the community prepare themselves and then serve. This is actually something, when the house is fully up and running, that the parish does once a month and anyone can participate in. I should mention that Sister Karen Dietz, the current interim director of Bethany House, is in the process with our parishioner Ann Bell of reopening the house after being closed at the beginning of the pandemic. And they are very, very eager for new volunteers. So if you have any interest, just get in touch with Duncan or I, and we can put you in touch with the right people.
One of the other opportunities that we have, and is very important, is School 50 tutoring. And many of our parishioners have been involved in this program. And this is a way to really encounter the poor, to encounter those in need. And again, we know that the educational system within the city of Rochester, as compared to the outside, is very differential. And so however we can help support the schools in the city, and especially since we're working with School 50, is a way to reach out and to share the gifts that God has given us. And it's a way of extending our care for the poor, for those that may not have the same advantages that we have here in Penfield. So this is a wonderful way to encounter the poor, to use your gifts to help those who are so needy. And it's a wonderful expression as you work with these children. We've had so many people say about how much they're given back from this encounter.
Another ministry that has just become so dear to us at St. Joseph's is the Mary's Place refugee outreach. And there's fewer and fewer refugees right now. But one of the things that we have been involved in now for 4 or 5 years is the literacy program there. So a few days a week, our parishioners working in pairs would go and assist in the literacy class, sometimes with people who have zero English. So imagine, trying to initiate some kind of a conversation to help them, be able to be out and about in the community and to be able to communicate with people. We also do lots with our parish Christmas giving program to help Mary's Place, both in terms of actually donating items, but then also we provide them with a space to organize all of that here, because that's just something they don't have space for. And then we participate in the party itself, which the photo there, very, very beautiful memory, and especially of our parishioner Peg Glisson, who just passed away recently. But she loved very much being a part of that ministry. She and her husband Tom really initiated some wonderful things there, as have Paula and Fran Cardella also in that photo. And I'm just noticing in our Q&A box something I want to read from one of our parishioners who I've had the privilege of going to Mary's Place with her. And in being with her, she has taught me a lot. She's not from this country herself, so she's got a keener eye, I think, for picking up on cultural differences. And she just wrote, encountering the poor can be challenging to be confronted with a different culture, different mindsets, or lifestyles that we may not be familiar with. But it can also help decrease fears of the Black, the refugees, the homeless, when we actually meet someone from those groups and get to know and appreciate them. And that was one of my very first experiences of Mary's Place. Was, I think we do all have sort of a fear of the immigrant or the refugee. And the populations at Mary's Place are some of the gentlest souls I've ever encountered in my life. It almost seems ludicrous that we would be fearful of this community of people. So a very, very wonderful experience to spend time there. And they are also just in the process of reopening. So they'll keep you in the loop if they need any kind of new volunteers.
We also have a couple of other, excuse me, a couple of other reflections one from a parent who thinks it's very important to have our kids experience an encounter with the poor, and thinking of the children both at School 50 and Mary's Place. When their children were younger, they went with a couple of other families to prepare and serve lunch at the Cameron Community Ministries. And they saw kids their own age who were less fortunate. And it was really helpful in really assisting the children to understand the encounter as well. And someone here who participates in fundraisers for organizations who are in need, to be able to join an organization that benefits people is a good step as well. If you're not sure how to do it, to join an organization or even one of our own ministries to learn what would be a first step.
Excellent.
I think that's so important, you know, especially when we think about our children, being able to expose them, but also for them to see our example of using our gifts, of reaching out to those who are in need, about how we live out our faith. Our kids always watch us, and they're always taking in, and that's how we, you know, extend our Christian values. And again, they're very insightful. I remember our children, when they were growing up, mentioning as they got older, you know, the different events that we would do and the impact it had in their lives. Another way to encounter the poor that we have a parish ministry is our partnership with Dimitri House. And we do that in a number of ways. During the fall and winter and early spring, we help provide staff for the overnights. This is a men's shelter, and men, for various reasons that aren't able to have housing, are able to stay in the shelter. And it's a very personal and valuable ministry. I've done it on many occasions and have been just touched by the interactions, my interactions with these men, their thoughtfulness and thankfulness for our participation. We usually try and prepare a small meal, sit down and talk with these individuals and understand where they're coming from. And it's just a very powerful ministry. They have a food cupboard, and we help them with providing food for the community there. But again, something to think about if you would like to reach out. Another ministry that we partner very closely with is RAIN, and Sharon Burke has been involved very much with RAIN. And this is the Rochester Area Interfaith Health Network. And this organization is very unique in that it strives to keep families together that are homeless or in a situation where they don't have housing. They use a model of basically having families stay at places of worship overnight, and then they have a day center. The day center helps supports the family, provides education, provides some meals, and then they're able to go back to the faith community. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, right now, RAIN is still operating, but they're using some housing based on hotels right now. But this is a wonderful way that our community is supporting, reaching out, and allowing families to stay together that normally would be broken apart. Although you may not understand totally, often with shelters, men and women are broken up, women and younger children can stay together. But this particular approach that RAIN uses allows the whole family unit to stay in place. And their goal is to provide permanent housing in a situation where these families can get a step up, provide help with finding jobs and housing, and have a step-by-step walk with these families so they move from their situation that brought them to homelessness into a situation where they're now able to provide for their families and have permanent housing. It's a wonderful, very powerful outreach that they're doing, and they're part of the Family Promise.
And I was wondering, just before we move to our final comments and a closing prayer, Jean Mooney, would you like to just share with us a little bit about what's going on this summer with our Summer Faith at Home and how those families are participating in service?
Thank you, Kathy. Yes, this summer, due to the pandemic, we transitioned our 2-week summer intensive classroom-based program to a family-based program where families are doing the lessons together with their kids. They're praying together, and also we've put together some service opportunities for the families. The first one is coming up this week, which is donating food to fill up the van, and I think the blanked of my mind, Penfield Hope, the Penfield Hope food collection. And I agree with what you said earlier, Duncan, that it's so important for families to model their faith to their children. It's not just a matter of just, being a faithful person. It's actually doing things together.
Nancy, any other comments that we might have missed along the way?
Sorry. Yes, we have a couple. One from one of our viewers said that they grew up in a small town, and a person their age whose father had died years ago, their family home was in great disrepair. The porch was falling down, and etc. They couldn't afford to fix it. And speaking of children and of making good example, this person couldn't fix her friend's house, but they could play together and be friends. And I think that is just a beautiful example of how children can be taught to encounter others. And like you said before, children aren't afraid typically of one another. And so that's really a beautiful way to take a look at what can any age person do. And another reflection was when they think of the poor, they think of people who work so hard to get a job and then work hard at the job but are still underpaid. These are those people who are most in need of our help. And certainly through so many of the things we do here at the parish and in our community with the ecumenical food shelf, I think that's a good step, and we always can do more.
It is so very true right now during the coronavirus that it is very much the people that viewer just mentioned who were underpaid to begin with, probably undervalued in their positions, and they're the people now losing their jobs. So, they weren't on stable footing to begin with. Right. And that is certainly something that, we're seeing, and some of that is households with children. So it's, really very, very distressing. And it's those are the people who really are going to need our prayers going forward, our hands-on contact, our contributions. And we do feel through Penfield Hope just very, very grateful for how generous people have been throughout these past few months, so that as needs now begin to arise, that we feel very, very well equipped to work with people. There's nothing worse than seeing someone in that kind of a scenario and have to say no because we don't have the means to help. Right now, we feel very well equipped to help. So thank you to everyone who has participated with us. So we're going to move on to a closing prayer. You're, of course, always welcome to get in touch with us if you've seen something here that intrigued you and you'd like to volunteer or just want more information. Just be in touch with any one of us. So you're welcome to pray along at home with this prayer. And then Duncan's going to give us a blessing at the end. So Lord God, you came to give honor to the least, those forgotten, overlooked, and misjudged. You came to give first place to the last, those left behind, misunderstood, and undervalued. You came to give a warm welcome to the lost, those who are orphaned, abandoned, and destitute. Help us to be your ears to listen to their cries. Help us to be your voice speaking out love and acceptance. Help us to be your feet, walking beside those in need. Help us to be your hands to clothe, feed, and shelter them. You came for the least, the lost, and last of the world. Lord, hear our prayer.
Amen. May the Lord bless you as you seek to serve the Lord in whatever capacity the Lord has placed in your heart. May Christ's abundant love and care be with you as you go forth, loving God and loving all, especially the poor, the abused, the forgotten, the outcast, the neglected, and for all those who God has charged for us to care for. And thank you so much for being here, for being part of our faith community, and for all that you do.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Duncan. Thank everybody who is with us today. As long as Jean is with us, I'd like to invite everybody to join with us again next Monday at 1 p.m., where Jean, our Director of Faith Formation at Holy Spirit and St. Joseph Sister Parishes, will do a presentation. Jean, would you like to give us a little insight as to what you might be teaching us next week?
Sure, thank you, Nancy. I'll be speaking about the church at home and how we can make our homes into places where we nurture and live our Catholic faith. We'll look at common roadblocks that families face and also some successful strategies that families can use to develop faith together in the homes. Young children tend to look to the adults in their lives as role models, and we'll talk about how to use our powers as strong role models for kids to help them grow in faith and also grow our own faith.
Thank you, Jean, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.